All right, welcome everyone to Ecosystem Restoration Deep Dive webinar that I'm very excited about. My friend Jakob Shockey, we have the pleasure of learning from today. Jakob is, well, he's a lot of things. He's a wealth of knowledge. He's the riparian restoration program director for the Applegate Partnership and Watershed Council. I'm wearing the t-shirt. Nice. I'm wearing the t-shirt. Jakob was my boss last year when I worked in streamside restoration locally here. And Jakob is also the owner and founder of Beaver State Wildlife Solutions here in Oregon, mitigating landowner wildlife conflicts, doing a lot of work on the beaver, but in general, he's an ecologist. He's a specializes in evolutionary behavior of mammals, but he's a wealth of knowledge. He plays a pretty good fiddle. I was trying to tell him to bring it out, and he's a great guy. Hi, Jakob. How you doing?
Hey, Tim. Thanks for inviting me to this.
Yes. Make sure you get your mic a little bit closer to the mouth, maybe.
How's that sound?
Good. Oh, that's much better. Yeah. And somebody already knows the deal. Benjamin, thank you. Collect your questions as they come up. Benjamin already has one, so we're collecting in the Q&A box that you'll see. And then if you want to chat with us and everybody else, there is the chat box as well. So we are going to get started here. We have a full bunch of wonderful happening. We got Jakob, and he's going to give us a nice deep dive presentation on the beaver, and why we want to think of them as an ally in ecosystem restoration and how. And we're also going to get a guest presentation that me and Jakob interviewed Scott Mcgill last week. And you'll hear about him in a little bit, but that's going to be really special too, a recorded presentation from him as well. And he's on the East Coast, so we'll get the Northwest beaver expert and the East Coast beaver expert, and well, we'll learn from some threads here. I also wanted to mention, before we get into everything, and I don't think to say it, the upcoming Global Earth Repair Conference in Washington, in Port Townsend, Washington, May 3rd through 5th. Jakob will be up there, one of the presenters. And if you can't make it, he will also be on one of the 3 panel discussions that I will be hosting, and those will all be webinars as well. So you can find that at museecology.com or the Global Earth Repair Conference website. But easiest place to find the registration link is museecology.com. But Jakob will be on a panel on allying with non-humans for ecosystem restoration with Derek Jensen and a whole lot of other great folks. So without any further ado, Jakob, let me give it to you. Introduce yourself any more you like, and let's get to your presentation. And then after that, folks, collect your questions in the Q&A box, because we're going to get into the Q&A after that. And so we're going to have a nice, good deep dive together. And welcome, everybody. Welcome, Jakob.
Excellent. Thank you, Tim. Okay, so this is going to be a deep dive. I've kind of collected a number of different aspects around beaver that I've been working in the last couple of years, and we'll plow in here. Let me share my screen with you.
That beautiful picture, by the way, is taken by Cheryl Reynolds. I've used it before in an article for Permaculture magazine, but she's great. She's taken some wonderful pictures, mostly of the Martinez beaver. Let's check them out. Yeah.
Yeah, I've got a number of her shots in this presentation.
Yeah.
She has some of the best pictures out there.
Props to Cheryl. Yeah.
Yep. Yep. And in fact, this one is one of my favorites.
Yeah.
All right. So here's an overview of kind of what I'll cover today. We'll start with an introduction where I'm coming to and sort of my lens on looking at beaver on the landscape. From there, we'll touch on the keystone role they play in ecosystem function, both here in North America, but also the entire Northern Hemisphere, really. And we'll move from that into historical context, specifically around humans and beaver and our co-occupation of the same landscape. from that point, we'll get into sort of the nuisance that they're seen as now, resolving some of those conflicts through natural science and design. And then from that, I'm going to try to present a framework for looking at beaver as allies in restoration, and sort of addressing that limiting factors on the landscape for getting beaver back in numbers on the landscape. So a lot of this is North American focused, because that's where I live and work, but it's very applicable to the European beaver too. Very similar. And then from there, we're going to kind of just discuss a strategic path forward. So an introduction, I used to be the kid skeptically watching my parents plant trees, and now I'm the parent planting trees on the same piece of land, which is cool. I've been sort of paying attention to restoration now for much of my life. And professionally, I work in sort of this realm of nonprofit organizations here in the Pacific Northwest. I work for a watershed council, which is a NGO. We go after grant fundings for specifically projects, restoration projects centered around wildlife that has been listed by our Endangered Species Act. So with the Endangered Species Act, there's a lot of possibility here in North America to get funding for recovery of specific species, and here the big driver is coho salmon. So we sort of work in this soup of logos, if you will, nonprofits, collaborating with agencies to do restoration work, and this is kind of where I spend a lot of my time here in Oregon. And we do a lot of the typical projects that you would see focused around salmon recovery. So here's a large wood debris placement project I did in the side channel on the Applegate River, creating cover and habitat and scour pools for salmon habitat. We do a lot of barrier removal of legacy concrete structures that are sort of dotted throughout our landscape. These primarily were for irrigating crops, diversions, and many like this one are now abandoned. We do a lot of invasive weed removal as well. This is blackberries. This is one of the sites Tim helped me with last year. And we take the blackberries out, and then we plant trees and we fence out the cattle. This is sort of the bread and butter restoration work of the Pacific Northwest around salmon.
Real quick, Jacob, can you say something about how we take them out? Because you're really keen about no spraying and all that, and eventually they become mulch. Just real quick, because that's one of the only reasons I could work for you.
Totally. Let's go back to this slide. So yeah, there's a lot of use of glyphosate in the restoration world, especially around invasive plants. We haven't ever used glyphosate as the Watershed Council, and so a lot of what we do is an initial removal mechanically, either through mulching or pulling up the blackberries. And so this picture here is showing sort of a mulched site. And then as the regeneration comes up, we're working off sort of a principle of depleting the carbohydrate stores. So we want that plant to put a lot of energy into its resprout, and we go in and hack it down with weed whackers on a big crew. And we kind of play that whack-a-mole game, targeting those points where the plant's going to be under high stress if we cut it back. And usually after 2 or 3 years, we've suppressed them enough. Meanwhile, we're planting, the site pretty thickly with our native species. So we're trying to kind of convert that site from predominantly an understory of invasive species. Here it's Himalayan blackberry.
And just to interrupt last time in the presentation, and then you end up after 3 to 5 years with this like layer of mulch that's pretty thick. But also, just to tease you guys, we're going to get to a different way of looking at this whole thing a little later as well. Think of the keystone element and process-based restoration. Anyway, just a teaser. I'm not going to interrupt again. Let's get into it.
No, this is good. I prefer it to be a conversation, so interrupt away. All right, so in the restoration field here in North America, it's a bit of a young field, really. And for the last 20 years, maybe we've been experimenting with, how do we build habitat, and we'll go out and we'll find habitat that everyone agrees upon is like, this looks like what we're after. Here in the West Coast especially, we're really only talking about 150, maybe 200 years since white folks moved into this area and started really dramatically changing the landscape. And so you can go find reference sites, and a lot of our restoration is based on these reference conditions. What are we after? And then the traditional approach has been sort of a forestry approach of, then let's build that. So we look at stem densities in the reference site, and then we plant to those stem densities and those same sort of patterns. And it really hasn't been working. Kind of 20 years in, there's a moment of reflection right now in the restoration community, where we're realizing that a lot of the work that we've been doing isn't resulting in the habitat. We're ending up with streams that now perhaps they're shaded, but the trees we planted in this dense forestry style planting look like an overgrown Christmas tree farm, on the side of on a bank. And we're realizing it's harder than you'd think to create habitat. So as I've been working in this world, occasionally one of the sites that we're working on will then be occupied by beaver after we've done some input, some project, the beaver move in. And on all these sites where beaver have moved into my area that I'm working, suddenly the habitat starts happening. And it's a cascade of function. And we'll get into that, sort of what beaver are doing on the landscape, but just their presence really has been that shift on a lot of these sites. And so I started thinking about, maybe instead of building these habitats, we need to be addressing limiting factors for beaver and getting beaver on the site to sort of help us with this. And this starts to move into kind of the recent movement into process-based restoration. And by just seeing our projects, our restoration projects, as addressing that limiting factor such that we can step away and the beaver can step into the site and build the habitat, those projects then are succeeding. And you get the complex, messy wetland habitat that everyone's after. So I think the first place to go with this is to kind of orient folks on beaver and what they're building in the landscape and why they're doing it. Because they create these highly dynamic landscapes, but it's a pretty simple set of rules governing their actions. And so there's a couple structures that beaver build, and that quite famously. The first is their lodge. This is often that cartoon-shaped mound of sticks in a wetland. It can also be on a bank, like the upper photo that was up in the Sawtooth Mountains in Idaho. And they'll build these when they really are trying to get up out of a wetted plain into a dry place. So they'll have an underwater entrance to that. And then they'll have a little cavity up in the dry area up out of the wetted plain. The other structure that they build, of course, is dams. And dams, there's beaver aren't living in the dams. Dams are primarily to back up water across the landscape. And so you'll have beaver damming and tributaries of a certain size where they don't have deep enough water already on the site to have an underwater entrance to a lodge. And here's an example of an entrance. So we've got a beaver dam and a small tributary, and then just upstream of that, you can see they've created this impoundment. You can see the entrance to their lodge right there into the bank. I'm kind of standing where their lodge would be. And then this is what it looks like underwater. And then as you crawl up into their lodge, this is a picture of, it's a beautiful little cavity. They have a little nest made out of willow branches and such. And it's up out of the water itself. That submerged front door is a really important thing to remember, though, when looking at beaver sites, because that is what keeps predators out of their home. And so much of their actions are driven around keeping that front entrance submerged. And it's all about avoiding predation. So beaver are really graceful in the water, and they're pretty clumsy, 60 pounds of protein on the land. And so there's a number of predators that enjoy beaver. In my area, it's the cougar, are probably their primary predator. So when you're looking at a beaver landscape and you're looking at the ponds, that's really a landscape the beaver is building to avoid predation. There's some other beaver signs. So you'll often see trails as they move out into their home range, their trails to go out and forage into the landscape with. These trails will often, especially if their beaver are using them a lot, they'll actually then make the decision to excavate them, to invest in these trails, and you'll get little canals too, where they can actually move through a site more silently in the water, and so you'll get this sort of fan of canal works out from the main beaver ponds. And then of course, we're familiar with the tree cutting too. This is a picture from up in Bavaria in Germany, and I was really excited because the Bavarian beaver is on a comeback, and we saw this as we were driving past somebody's field, and I went and trespassed for this picture because it's cool to see the European beaver coming back onto the landscape too. Finally, sort of feeding and diet for beaver. They are strict vegetarians, and they eat primarily the cambium layer from woody species of trees and shrubs in the fall and winter. And then as you move into the spring, they're specializing on aquatic vegetation or little forbs and shrubs or grasses. So they have kind of a varied diet based on seasonality. A lot of people don't realize they have beaver on their site until the fall comes, when a lot of the more herbaceous plants are dying back, and the beaver start specializing more on woody species. And they'll build these little rafts. So you'll often see these like little platforms of skinned sticks where they hang out and they eat. Those are sort of zones that they feel safe in. And so that's another sign you'll often see. So thinking about beaver then through that lens of kind of what's motivating them, we get sites like this. This was a 7-acre cattle pasture near to where I live a number of years ago, and absentee landowners bought it. The beaver were allowed to do what they do. The stream was incised and diked to one side of the cattle pasture historically to open this up for forage. And the beaver created, a 7-acre wetland complex. And you can see, the drowned Doug firs in the background. They create a really complex, messy habitat. We have this term in biology, keystone species, right? And that's this idea around the Roman arch and the main keystone on the top. And if you pluck that out, the whole arch crumbles. And beavers really serve that role in the aquatic systems of the Northern Hemisphere. And you can zoom in on sort of any element of what they're doing, but the long and the short of it is they're creating functioning wetland habitat. So as you dive into the literature, there's increases in nesting sites for birds, increases in vegetation are pretty astounding. Here in North America, we have the neotropical migratory birds that are riparian dependent, and they've been suffering, and so it sort of grows that niche of the riparian vegetation. You see increased waterfowl populations. In fact, a lot of the early beaver reintroductions were headed up by sportsmen's groups here in North America, and increased fish populations. The fish habitat that beaver create on the landscape is stunning. There's also sort of a benefit to the human component as well. As we look across the landscape here, we're struggling with regional drought, and many of our streams have incised to the point where floodplains have disconnected, and the whole system is simplified. And beaver dams help with that sediment retention. They slow the water, allowing it to sequester into the local water table, and there's a lot of good work being done with trying to help, working in tandem with beaver to build back up incised systems with goals around groundwater retention and floodplain reconnectivity. Here's another image, kind of just showing, you know, what you're doing with water on the landscape when you get a series of beaver dams. And one of the popular things in my neck of the woods recently has been to take some of these incised systems that are too steep and too degraded for beaver maybe to make a stand in, and get a head start on that natural process by creating a man-made fake beaver dam. These have been going by the name beaver dam analog. And the idea being here that, you know, this is kind of that first push that we make with our project, addressing a limiting factor for beaver, such that as we start to slow these water with these artificial structures, we start to grade the stream a little bit, then the site becomes more hospitable to beaver themselves moving in and kind of taking over maintenance of that.
Jacob,
You look like you want to say something, Tim.
yeah, before you move from beaver dam analogs, do you mind, since you brought it up, speaking to a little bit of the complex nuance involved in that, site, you know, site appropriateness, and then when you would use it, and then also some of the reasons why a beaver dam being more ideal, but at the same time, sometimes you might need these to bring them in. But in specifically, like we don't know about salmon passage with beaver dam analogs. Can you speak to that a little bit, that kind of complex approach to when to use beaver dam analogs? Because like I've heard you say, it's kind of a sexy new thing that people are getting into. And it's like, hey, we could be beavers. And, you know, so can you speak to that complexity and nuance in decision-making with respect to beaver dam analogs?
Yeah, they are kind of the sexy new thing. I think recently there was a paper in Nature published on them. I mean, they're kind of hitting that big front end of restoration. There's two big things you hear in North America right now: beaver dam analogs and stage 0 restoration. And those are two of the big things that people are playing with. And some of the nuances to think about with these are that so what you can't see in this picture is the they pounded in these stakes sort of across the channel, and then there's a wattle of willow that's then woven into this. And the idea is you create a thick enough wattle that you're starting to aggrade sediment behind the structure. And as sediment aggrades and backs up behind the structure, then you come in with additional, say your first structure is here, you come in with additional structures here and here, and you slowly build your stream up out of its trench. Complexity with that is you're basically building a willow fence across a stream. And so for fish passage, you know, beaver dams a number of years ago were looked at as potential fish barriers. When you're thinking about beaver dams and fish barriers, you know, you really just have to kind of remember the context here. You know, that this area that I live, the old timers tell pictures of fishing for salmon with pitchforks, you know, or so thick that they couldn't drive a horse through the stream because the horse would step on fish. And this was the same landscape that you know, wetted with a necklace of beaver ponds. And so beaver and fish are co-evolved. There's a bumper sticker in my area that says beaver taught salmon to jump. But in that natural beaver dam, there's many messy ways for fish to get through. A lot during high water, you know, you have a lot of flow around the wings of the dam. The dam is highly porous, and you know, the hydrology that you're creating is just very different potentially than a single line of willow wicker. So there's a lot of fish passage concerns for especially juveniles moving up into a system. In my area, as it starts to heat up in the summertime, you get a lot of juvenile fish movement up further and further into tributaries where the water is cooler and cooler. And so this could be a potential problem for juvenile fish. So there's a lot of folks looking at that. Also looking at, could we not fence off the whole creek? Could we do, you know, offset BDAs in such a way that we're still grading the sediment? Maybe, you know, we're capturing the foul leg, right, which is that deepest part of a stream, but we're leaving sides open to them too. So yeah, BDAs are an interesting technique. We'll get into it a little bit later with sort of the strategic framework, but I really see these as the best tool in areas where your site is limited. Beaver are limited for your site based on extreme velocity in the channel. So
Yeah.
the channel is so degraded and so in size that no one colony of beaver can make a stand and put up a dam. It'll just blow out, right? So you're doing like a project to massively slow water on a large scale.
Yeah. One more thing
Reconnect the floodplain.
before we leave this, I just had a thought of something that maybe we got to work on. BBDAs, better beaver dam analogs, because there's these certain cases where we want to put these things in to make the habitat to bring the beavers back, but maybe without some of the negative side effects. So still without saying, hey, we're going to be beavers, and the amount of time and evolutionary knowledge that there's no way we're going to be beavers. But maybe there's a way we could, through kind of mimicking their behaviors, maybe it takes a little longer. This like, oh, let's do it like they do it kind of thing a little more. Do you think there's a possibility of doing better beaver dam analogs without saying, hey, we're beaver,
Oh, totally. And, I think they're not a one size fits all solution either. So in areas of deep conifer forest and in my area, maybe a more applicable way to slow velocity that's more true to sort of the environment of the site would be large wood debris placements, because the idea is you're addressing that limiting factor for beaver on the site through slowing velocity. And so I've seen sites where we do a large woody debris installation on the site, and then that site is occupied by beaver, and they'll den up into the large woody debris placement. And because you've got logs and you've got the scour pool that then's created with that, I think there's a number of different ways that we can do that without trying to pretend to be beaver.
Yeah.
The people that I've talked to that have done these say that they're just an incredible amount of maintenance.
Yeah.
And they can fail too, like the whole fence can flop over if you're post snap. But there's also some really incredible stuff that's been done with these and reconnecting floodplains, and then you can't just go plant willows on the side of an incised stream and expect them to grow. But a lot of these, where you can bring that water back up to more of a functioning floodplain, well, then the willow recruit naturally, and you start getting that riparian restoration done through doing in-stream restoration, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah. So basically, human innovation can be helpful, but it is never the case probably that one technique fits all. Something like that.
Right.
Yeah. All right, let's move on. Yeah.
Well, this ties in pretty well, actually. So this book, I like to mention, Three Against the Wilderness. Fellow wrote it. It's kind of an autobiography from his time in the late 1800s in sort of the backcountry of Canada. Him and his family moved out there. They built a cabin. He was a professional fur trapper, and he moved into a site that was highly degraded. A wildfire had just burnt through this wetland complex. Beaver had been trapped out prior to that. And him and his son, as a strategy toward fur trapping, built a series of fake beaver dams throughout this wetland, because they realized that if they had a functioning beaver wetland, that would bring in the mink. The upper animal in that photo is a mink, the lower one's a beaver, and they're pretty hand in hand in the wetland systems here. And with the mink, you brought in all the predators like the coyotes that were the high value furs for this fellow. And so it's great because it's a fur trapper doing restoration work before all the biologists got involved and we're drawing all these links ourselves. This guy had drawn all the links and was out there building and maintaining fake beaver dams with his son to bring in the cascading ecosystem that came with that. Eventually he was able to persuade the Canadian government to give him a pair of beaver, and he got beaver back out on the site to the point where he could then sustainably harvest the beaver too. So this has been something that we've been noticing for a long time. This was a map drawn up, and you can see right there in that center this sort of necklace of beaver ponds. That's often how it was described in the and the Pacific Northwest as folks were moving into these areas. We didn't have free-flowing creeks like you imagine them now. And there was more of just sequential ponds and sort of anathematous channels, and this was the landscape that then we moved into, the trappers moved into in a big way. And trapping in North America was spurred on primarily by the hat market. These hats were fashionable at the time. One of our very famous presidents wore one, and they were literally the currency of the land. So there were these tokens put out by the Hudson Bay Company that were an MB, a made beaver, and a made beaver was a finished beaver pelt. And so this was kind of your first gold standard, but it was a beaver standard, and anything that was bought and sold in this land was bought and sold on the premise of how many beaver pelts it was worth. So not only was it sort of the currency of the land, but it was also a natural resource that was sort of being used on a geopolitical level. So this is the first white guy into my area, Peter Skin Ogden. He was working for the Hudson Bay Company at the time, and he killed a couple First People up in the Washington area, and the company wanted to get him out of town because he was going to have to go on to trial. And so they sent him on this expedition. So you had the Hudson Bay Company up in sort of the Washington State area, and you had the American trappers moving up the coast of California. And so the Hudson Bay Company, in an effort to sort of forestall the American fur trappers coming up into their territory, decided to create what they would consider a fur desert, and this broad swath of land that they were going to take every single fur bearer out. And the reasoning was, once the American fur trappers get up to this point of the fur desert, they're going to turn around because there's nothing there for them. And so this guy was sent down on that objective. He got into my area, and two of the tribes were in conflict, and this was a kind of telling quote from the time. He wrote in his journal, "May they destroy each other, the more the better. If they are fond of war, let them enjoy it, and we in the meantime will endeavor to wage war on their beaver." And that's what he did. They went through, they took out all the beaver, the young ones and the old ones. They took out the river otter.
Almost all.
They really, almost all, yep. And really wiped the slate. And that had implications, because then as the naturalists were starting to come through after the fact, like a famous naturalist in our area, Joseph Grinnell, and we had Muir and these fellows moving through the landscape afterward and recording the landscape that they saw. Streams were already devoid of beaver at that time, and so it's taken a little bit for people to realize, this historic landscape that was first recorded was not, in fact, kind of pre-contact landscape, and especially this sort of babbling brook that we all like to imagine probably did not exist in the same way. In Europe, the beaver were pressured, thousands of years prior. This is a cool image that I found from a sort of a medical book. So beaver have castoreum glands, and they produce salicylic acid in these glands based on especially their eating of willow, and that acts very similar to aspirin when we take it. And so these glands were prized as a medicinal throughout Europe, and had very aspirin-like qualities. I heard one person saying that beaver have two of these glands. One of them was worth a year's wages if you were a kind of typical day laborer. And so a beaver has two, and then the pelts and the animal itself was worth another year's wages. So you were looking at 3 years' wages if you were successful enough to capture a beaver, which created a massive impetus to go take out beaver across the landscape. The Catholic Church didn't help at all. They decreed that because beaver had scales on their tail and they lived in the water, they must be a fish, which meant that you could eat them during those holy days when you weren't supposed to eat red meat. So this was one of the few red meats on offer during Lent and such as well. So kind of between the two, you saw Europe starved for beaver pretty early on. And they really were, a natural resource when the Europeans showed up here. They were harvested much the same way that gold was harvested, and then trees were harvested, and oil was harvested after that. And it's interesting because they were seen as a natural resource then to be extracted, and then over the last 100 years, they've kind of just fallen into this little category of a pest animal or a nuisance animal. And only recently have we started to realize that they're indeed a natural resource, but one that we have to retain on the landscape, even if only for our own selfish reasons.
Because they're more than a resource, right? They're an ally.
Right. So getting into where we bump heads. There's a few things that beaver do that drive people crazy. I think we have a hard time with any other animal that engineers its landscape. And beaver do it in close proximity with us. So one of the big conflicts that people run into with beaver are, the cutting of trees, the tree mortality. You both get trees cut by beaver for their food, but also, in these wetland systems that they create, as you can see there, they drown a lot of trees as well. So this could be seen as ugly, but there's some really beautiful functioning habitat there. You can see the heron rookery up in the snags, and you're going to get bat colonies roosting and all of that peeling bark, and just a cascading ecosystem. But it's an eyesore for some folks. With cutting trees, it's important to remember that a lot of these species co-evolved with beaver pressure. So in my area, species like willow and cottonwood especially will coppice when a beaver comes in and cuts them. And there's some interesting work that was done that looks at actual increase in phenolic compounds present in the tree resprouts after it's been coppiced by beaver. So in fact, the tree has a defensive mechanism where it's making itself more bitter as it's gone after. And so you may not have like the classic lollipop tree, but these trees remain on the landscape and they become more complex and often better nesting sites for birds.
Can you real quick speak to, since you mentioned those compounds that it puts out, one thing that I found super fascinating where I heard of it, and I think it was from you originally, and then, but how then they stop releasing those compounds after a certain amount of time, when it's kind of like, because if a willow, for instance, is not coppiced over a certain amount of years, it will get senescent and it'll lose vitality. And so there's a certain point where it wants to get eaten, so it'll stop releasing chemicals that make it taste worse. So it's actually kind of like this language dialogue between like chemical, the chemist and the taster, and there's this like conversation that happens. You speak to that real quick?
Yeah, I haven't seen data on like a decline in phenolic compounds, but I think we could probably predict that. It would be an interesting thing to look at. I do know that beaver will go through a site and taste trees, and so there's definitely a conversation, in a sense, if you will, with the riparian vegetation. And beaver are they're territorial animals. They mate for life, and they occupy these territories that they're on for generations. And so I think it's a much more complex thing than just beaver wandering up onto the bank and deciding to chew this tree or that tree. They're existing on the landscape with a number of trees, and they're going through, and one tree that they haven't touched for years and years and years, suddenly they decide that's the one. But you'll see that they go through and taste trees on the landscape, and that becomes important later as we're talking about how to kind of keep them from eating specific trees.
I like that. It's kind of like how we think about indigenous people sometimes. the way we have, at least, where it's like, oh, they do that, and it's for that simple reductionist reason, when really they have a
Yeah.
culture that's really holistically connected to the whole system. And there's so many ways that beavers and humans are similar. I know we're going to get into that more later, so let's go on.
Yeah, and I mean, even that hypothesis around phenolic compounds is very much that reductionist thinking of like, well, it must be bitter, and that's why they're not cutting it. We don't really know.
Yeah.
It's just one thing that we can measure that seems to suggest that it's more complicated.
Right. There's a conversation, but we don't claim to know it. Okay, good.
Yep. So there's pretty effective ways to protect trees in those places where we're intolerant of beaver harvesting them. One way that's been used across landscapes for a long time is sort of this welded wire mesh. Some important things with welded wire mesh: make sure that it's a pretty small sized opening, and then go pretty high. Go a meter high, 3 feet high, something like that. And then if you're in an area that gets snow, you have to think about a beaver coming in on the snow line. So where's that on the tree is another important question. And then also leaving room for the tree to grow. So I've seen trees that were protected, and a decade later, whoever was caring about those trees is no longer there, and the tree grows into this wire cage, and it girdles the tree, and the tree dies. So that's one of the potential dangers with using wire. Another important thing, if you look at this picture, the root collar often flares out, and to remember to kind of protect that as well. Because if you just sit around cylinder on that and leave that root collar exposed, beaver will come in and girdle it at that point. Here's a couple trees that I've photographed out on landscapes that didn't get protected too well. So here we have kind of a standard fencing size, 4 inches by 4 inches, that's used for cattle all over the lands, and this tree was protected by that, and the beaver came in and just dug a 4 inch by 4 inch hole out of the tree at every single one of those points. And then this other photo on the left obviously worked for a time, enough for the tree to actually grow into that metal T-post there. But then the beavers squashed down the wire. It was a thin sort of latticey chicken wire, and they tried to cut the tree down and hit the metal post. And so now this is a pretty fantastic hazard tree in the middle of a city park. So that's another important thing to remember. Chicken wire, while it's the right size, you're dealing with a 60-pound animal that can pretty easily crush that. So my preferred method is a mixture of sand and paint. If you use clean, dry sand and you mix it in with latex paint, you can make a slurry that you paint up on the tree, kind of the same heights, and that creates kind of a rubberized sandpaper. And the beaver, for whatever reason, when they're tasting the trees, they bite into that. It's grinding their teeth, and they reject those trees. It lasts a long time. As the tree grows, you'll start getting the sand and paint mixture starts splitting, and you're going to have to go in and reapply it. But depending on the tree species, you're looking at like every 5 or 10 years. And it doesn't work on saplings. That's the important thing to remember. So anything where the beaver are just going to come in and harvest it with one bite, this sort of textured version isn't going to work very well. And you can really have fun with this too. So you can go to your local paint store and just buy like a reject color. If it doesn't matter, it's somewhere far out on the landscape that no one cares about the color. And here's a couple examples that I've seen of folks just using some random color. Or you can get really creative about it. This is the Sierra Wildlife Coalition, and the tree there with the orange flag has been painted with sand and paint, and you can hardly tell because they came in with highlights afterward, and it blends right into the landscape. And so it's really, just up to your creativity on how well you want to blend this into a tree.
Jacob, real quick, can you speak to the types of latex paint? Because I understand there's like a synthetic, which we don't know what that might do, and then we also have like a natural one. It's based on like a tree sap. Can you speak to the type of latex paint Is that a relevant choice?
Yeah, and I've been meaning to do more research on that myself. So
Mm-hmm.
um, there are more natural latex paints, and that's what I would steer toward, especially since you're painting this on the landscape next to rivers systems. And I don't know, I know that one of the factors with outdoor latex paint is that they often incorporate aluminum and some other heavy metals to kind of as like a color fast property, to keep the colors from fading. And so I've heard it suggested before that you want to go with interior latex, but then I've also recently heard that that won't last as long, blah, blah, blah. So I need to do a little more research. I've just in the past honestly gone and bought reject paint, and it's worked quite well. But I think there could be some more thought put into like exactly which paint products would be the best. I know that, latex has a certain amount of stretch to it, and it seems to be kind of the base paint that we want to be working on, but I'm sure the natural paints would be a better way to go. And then when you get to crops and orchards, when you can't go in and paint every tree or every sugar beet, electric fencing is really a, a really successful strategy, because you've got an animal coming out of the water that's soaking wet, generally dragging its whole torso along the ground, and it's kind of the perfect animal to look at electric fencing for because it's really well grounded. You can do 2 bare wires pretty close to the ground itself and exclude beaver from a really large area of landscape. So this works really well on crops especially. Some things to think about there is, you're putting bare electric wires near to the ground, so you've got to maintain vegetation under that. So it's a heavy maintenance thing, if you will. But you can just put a little solar charger on there with the little snap electrical, and it works really well. So that kind of rounds out conflicts with trees and crops. As we get into the other thing that beaver do, they flood our landscapes, and not only our built-in landscapes, they're pretty successful at flooding farm landscapes too. So this is a site that I was walking with some folks, and this farmer was losing 7 acres of productive farmland. He was growing a fescue seed there because the beaver were turning it into a wetland, and that was not in alignment with his ideas. Ultimately what ended up happening is we did a non-lethal solution. So it was cool. The beaver got to be, stay on the site and kind of continue the good work that they were doing. But we really artificially limited the impacts of the beaver here to a pretty narrow place. And, we took this wetted landscape and dried it up. And, if we're being honest with ourselves, we're it's all about trying to find that line where we can coexist, but where we're artificially kind of diminishing the potential benefit that beaver have to offer there. So flow devices. There's 3 sort of main strategies, if you will. And the fellow that I learned from, Mike Callahan, has really done a lot of work to sort of develop these into solutions that can be applied broadly and are highly effective. You've got the flexible pond leveler, the pipe and fence, and the culvert fence. And so we'll kind of get into those 3 here. So these are long, sort of gangly devices. If you kind of look at them from a side view, what you're doing, beaver will look for a leak in their dam at the surface of the dam, right? So they'll swim up to it and really obsess over patching any leak in the surface of the dam. But if you artificially move that dam or that leak out into their pond, you're much more likely to be able to keep it hidden from the beaver. And so this system here, you're running a culvert pipe out into the pond. At the point where it goes through the beaver dam, that's the point you're controlling the impoundment level to. And generally these are, somewhere around 40 feet in length, and hopefully totally submerged then at the inlet side. And the inlet is caged primarily to keep beaver from ever swimming close enough to that inlet to sense that there's water leaving. So if they feel that there's water leaving through this spot, they'll dam it full of mud in a heartbeat. And so your cage, that's roughly 6 feet, maybe 3 feet or roughly a meter in radius off of this pipe, excludes beaver at a far enough length so that they can't really feel that water is moving out of the system there. So it's a pretty simple solution. It works really well. Here in the Pacific Northwest, we've got some added complexity around fish passage. And so, looking at what are we doing to the natural fish passage over a beaver dam by artificially constricting flow? And this pipe is an important question. I've been building these such that if an adult salmon moving upstream happens to jump into the pipe due to false attraction, then at least there's a way for them to be facilitated out of that cage without coming in contact with the metal. So I'll do like a cylinder of flexible mesh and then a one-way flapper door. But I'm actually working with folks to kind of refine this even further and really try to do away with the false attraction at the outflow. But these are highly effective. I forget what the success rate is that Mike Callahan has, but I think in his whole sample size, which is pushing 800 devices at this point, it's like a 95% success rate over, I think his timeline is 7 years or 10 years. So these work really well. And the cool thing is, you're dealing with a territorial animal that's occupying one site over a long period of years. And so once they've acclimated to this, it really stabilizes the situation for a really long period, because they're not going to keep trying to toy with it unless something happens that dramatically alters what's going on. And there was another woman that I worked on recently. Her land, she's lived with beaver for over 30 years on her property, and recently the beaver just kind of started creating such a wetland that the water table came up to the point where she couldn't flush her toilet anymore. And at that point, she was like, all right, the beaver have got to go. And so we were able to strategically put one of these in on the pond that was influencing the area where, her septic system was, such that she could flush her toilet again. And, then she's fine. The beaver can stay. So these are definitely an important tool in those places where you've got beaver on the landscape in close proximity to people. And if you bring down that impounded water, you can come to some sort of agreement, around where that beaver is impacting the landscape. Some of the important things to remember, though, is if you get greedy and try to bring it down too much, you'll probably just drive the beaver into building another dam or moving into another spot, because they have that entrance to their den that we discussed. And so it's important to kind of find that entrance and realize that whatever level you're dropping the water, you need to maintain submersion of that entrance, or you're going to, instead of stabilizing the situation, you're going to kind of throw it into instability where the beaver's trying to figure out what to do next. So yeah, the other places beavers get themselves in a lot of trouble, especially, are road culverts. So if you're a beaver on a body of water and you see a roadway, there's a culvert, that's like one hole in a perfectly good dam. And so they're really efficient at plugging that one hole. And when they do, our roads flood out. It causes all sorts of extreme consternation. And there's a couple things that we can do to keep that from happening. So in a situation where you've got a wetted landscape, I'll actually click to this next picture to show you. You can build a trapezoidal culvert fence, and this kind of takes advantage of the fact that beaver, their impetus to dam is based on the sound of rushing water. And they've done little experiments where they'll put like
and feel. When I wrote sound in that article, Mike Callahan said, one correction, it's the sound and feel of water. So he corrected me on that.
That's true.
Yeah. So.
Well, yeah, and I mean that's why our exclusionary fence on the pond leveler too has to be so, because they're feeling that through their whiskers and through their fur. Yep. So that takes advantage of this in that the beaver will start damming on this fence near to the culvert where they're getting that cue to dam, and the water's rushing past them, right? And as they dam out on these wings, they dam out into still water. And as they get into the point, you know, on this fence where the water has stilled, they have no cue to for that damming activity anymore. And often you'll get like a couple feet on either side of beaver damming, and then they'll leave the device alone. And so you've got water still moving in from that whole front end of the device, and your culvert can operate at full capacity. That only works in situations where you've got a road kind of basically butting up to a wetland, so that you have a pool of water you can work in, because this only works if the whole device is surrounded by water. So then sort of a marriage of the two that we've talked about, you can build a fence around a culvert and kind of exclude beaver off damming around that culvert itself, and then install a flexible pond leveler into that. And so you're basically giving the beaver an armature to dam against, and that way they can maintain whatever depth of impoundment that they're after. And then you're setting an artificial cap on that depth with your pond leveler. So during high flows, you know, these things are designed to operate as sort of during base flows. Beaver will be really active in damming in our area when water is becoming scarce, so, you know, late spring through the fall. And so that pipe really just has to be kind of moving water at that level, such that when the beaver are damming up past your intake for your flexible pond leveler, they keep damming, and that dam doesn't result in any more backing up of water, and they'll stop. It's not like they'll keep going and just build a dam on dry, you know, up. If it's not backing water, they're going to stop damming. And so then when you get high flows, the water moves over the crest of that beaver dam, and you've got, you know, the full capacity of whatever culvert was installed in the roadway. Fish passages on these is even trickier. I'm experimenting with one-way flapper doors on the whole front of a trapezoidal culvert fence. And then with the pipe and fence, looking at, instead of putting in fencing, can we do something where we, you know, tear the beaver dam out around the culvert itself, and then provide the beaver an armature to build on, maybe like a beaver dam analog style with just the posts. I know Mike Callahan's been successful doing this with just even lines of rock and creating a riffle, and then the beaver will come in and build their dam there, so that you have more of a natural dam. And then if need be, you can set kind of an apex level on the impoundment. So a lot of these, it's even simpler than a device like this. You can suggest an alternative dam location potentially, and that sometimes will work.
Looks like this would compound the fish passage effects of a culvert, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep. And wildlife passage. So Mike has been really experimenting too with, okay, so we've got upstream and downstream movement of things other than fish too. And in the East Coast, you know, you've got snapping turtle and some bigger turtles too. So you can run, but, you know, other things as well. You can run part of your fence up onto dry land in such a way that if you were to have an animal come upstream through that culvert, and they kind of are tracking around trying to figure out how to get through the fence, they'll end up out on the bank, and they can kind of go around it naturally. And beaver won't think to follow the fence up onto dry land to come back in with damming material. So it really still works quite well at keeping beaver excluded from the culvert. And I've seen GoPro videos of these areas, and, you know, you have river otter and raccoon and all sorts of stuff cruising back and forth through these wildlife passages that kind of go overland, so to speak. So yeah, these are important tools for coexisting with beaver, but we've got to be really careful to try to minimize the negative implications of what we're, you know, all the additional stuff we're putting out there. And here's the pipe and fence in action. You can see kind of the beaver dam built around it. So clearly a fish passage concern. We need to do more to work on that one. And then this is really kind of specific to the Pacific Northwest, but I wanted to include it just to give folks an idea of what to think about around liability and permitting. Everybody's got different agencies and different officials to interface with, but here in my area, with the tree protection, electric fencing is something to be careful about, especially during fire season. There's some kind of best management practices for putting an electrical fence that minimizes your chance of it grounding out on some vegetation and starting a fire. That's something to think about. And then flow devices, fish passage is important. Also, so there was an instance up in Washington State where somebody notched a beaver dam, and then it later failed and flooded a downstream neighbor's property. And that upstream neighbor that altered the beaver dam was held liable for the flooding that occurred on the downstream person's property. And the argument was made basically like, you took a natural stable system and you destabilized it, and now you're liable. So we are taking on some amount of liability by going in and messing with these systems. And then here, it's really easy to kill a beaver. And so that's predominantly what folks do. The problem with that is in these areas that you've got beaver on the landscape, beaver have been on the landscape and will continue to be on the landscape because it's good habitat. And so often you'll get, a colony trapped out, and pretty quickly a new colony will move in and occupy that same niche. And so people get on these treadmills of lethal removal of the beaver colonies, and it never really leads anywhere productive. Beaver live in family units. Like I said, they mate for life. They have kits in the springtime, and then those kits actually stick around for a full year before dispersing out onto the landscape as teenagers. And so often a colony will be somewhere between 6 and 8 animals. And so these flow devices are really useful in those spots where you've got continuing conflict, and you're looking to stabilize that and sort of get off of your treadmill. So we can then, kind of understanding beaver behavior and the solution toolkit that is out there, we can then look at predictive management, and if we've got beaver out on a site, how can we predict both their actions and plan for those actions from sort of how are they going to impact human stuff, and then also if we're planning for restoration, how can we plan for the benefits too? So I got a little example here. This is a park that's been working with beaver on its landscape. Here's sort of the satellite view, and the day I was out walking, these were all the beaver dams we found. You can see it's got heavy urban sprawl all around it. It's this little oasis of green. And we'll zoom in on this beaver dam here. So you can see the dam. This is it's a kind of an artificial stream channel, and that beautiful curve that you kind of see was an engineered curve. This was a restoration project. You can also see the vegetation downstream of the dam is very much in rows. And beaver moved into that restoration project probably because there was some limiting factor addressed, like potentially, now there's all this food. And they built a dam, and you can see it's flooding the bike path. And so this is kind of that perfect situation where you've got a green space, and the sort of management directives around the green space align with beaver to some extent. But you've got this trail that folks are commuting to work on, and so if you can lower that impoundment with a flow device such that trail opens up, it kind of stabilizes everything, and you can retain the beaver on the landscape. So some final thoughts on predictive management. If you're looking at a site with beaver and you're trying to kind of anticipate what you can see in the years to come, it's important not to just go out and protect every tree. You'll make yourself crazy, and it really it's wasted effort. There's specific species that don't coppice, so those are the ones I like to really focus on, or the special trees. So, grandpa's fruit tree that was planted before you were born and everyone in the family really cares about, that's a tree to really carefully protect. Beaver really love fruit trees too, especially. But any of these trees that, have some sentimental value or don't coppice and will die from beaver cutting are kind of the ones that I like to target. Also remembering too that if we protect all the trees, we're just going to drive the beaver out or onto some neighboring property.
I just realized, in case anybody's wondering, we've used the word coppice, and I just realized I want to make sure everybody knows what the term means. Can you just define it real quick?
Yeah, it's kind of a term that ag has used for a long time too, where you can go in and lop a tree off at a certain height, and it's the ability for the tree to recover from that with regrowth, and you'll get a tree that is then multi-stemmed. In my area, there's a lot of the riparian species that have co-evolved with beaver and so have coppicing tendencies around beaver cutting, and they require some amount of trunk left. And then there's, up in the uplands, you have coevolution with fire, and the same coppicing tendency has kind of come about there too, where you've got oaks and madrones and such that'll the whole upper plant will catch fire and burn, but then the root structure will resprout. So yeah, those are trees where the organism keeps living. You just get a different structure above ground.
Nice.
And then remembering too that trees can drown from beaver impacts as well. This often blindsides folks. They'll protect them and then not realize that they're completely submerged in their roots, and then the tree dies. So there's this distinction a little bit with various dams on a beaver site. They'll have their home dam, or the dam that's responsible for backing water up over their den entrance, and that one they care a lot about, because that's the one that is basically keeping their front door closed. And then they have auxiliary dams out over the landscape that are really tied into wetting the landscape on a large level, and those they care a little less about. So you can mess with those a little more readily, and they aren't quite as fast to fix things. So reading your site and looking at what kind of dam are we playing with is an important strategy. And then also realizing that if we're indeed going to stabilize the site with beaver, we need to allow some impoundment. So what's the human tolerance such that the beaver can stay there? Potentially, sometimes you can suggest a better dam location. So in areas where, say up north in my state, a lot of farmers have drain tiles under their pastures to artificially drain the water off earlier in the season. And so in like an instance where you've got a drain tile, which these are basically perforated pipes at this point, coming into a beaver impoundment, and it's backing up water into the drain tile, you can potentially suggest a new dam location just upstream of that tile outlet. And the strategy around that is to remove the whole beaver dam in one day, and then build kind of a shoddy impression of another beaver dam where you prefer it. Making sure that, if it's an auxiliary dam, it doesn't really matter, but if it's a home dam, that you're still downstream of their den entrance. And often the beaver will come back that night and patch it up, and take that new dam on as their new spot. And so there's a couple little strategies like that too. So then kind of coming back out of the nitty gritty there and looking across the landscape and thinking about, how could we get more toward that necklace of beaver ponds that retained water in our landscape and had all the auxiliary benefits that they did. I think it's important to kind of structure this in some framework. So this is my last little piece, and then we'll dive into some questions. So one useful tool, you can model intrinsic potential for beaver habitat. So these are, most people are working in some system where beaver have been, their numbers have been reduced, and we're not really sure, what those numbers could come back to. And you've got the added complexity of that we've built up a lot of built environment in a lot of the historic beaver habitat, and so you can use some features in the landscape to kind of model what was the intrinsic potential on this landscape for beaver. And so things like valley gradient, valley width, stream width. You can kind of, on a bird's eye view, do a GIS exercises and call out on the landscape, okay, these are the places that beaver potentially do well. So this is kind of a draft image from one of these that I'm working on right now. And it gives you a rough sort of historic distribution. And it also can kind of get at project planning areas too. So you can, from this, you can kind of go ground truth sites and look for those limiting factors. So often what you'll see as the main limiting factors, so you run this model, you've got predicted good beaver habitat in some areas, and then you go out and look for beaver, and you'll either find beaver there in my area, or you won't. And if you don't, there's a couple things to kind of to think through before we jump on some solution. So if you don't find beaver there, the first thing to kind of check is the habitat good? So and the main limiting factors that we often see in this area are either velocity limited, like we talked about earlier, with incised streams, high velocity, or vegetation limited. So they've either been overgrazed or farmed, and there's just no forage available. So you look for those two limiting factors, and if it's not that, potentially it was humans too. And if you have a site where everything looks like good beaver habitat, but they're not there, then you kind of want to think through like why aren't they here? So we'll kind of organize all this into a framework where it's easier to think about. But this is kind of the three main areas that beaver are limited across the landscape: is either reduced beaver population, degraded beaver habitat, like velocity or vegetation, and then finally a close proximity with people. So in the instance of reduced beaver population, so in my area, we've got beaver along the main stem river, the Applegate River. And you'll see sticks and you'll see dens occasionally all along the river. And an important thing to realize is that if you're a beaver, the main stem river is really peachy real estate because you have deep water. You don't have to dam to create a safe area. You often have a lot of willow and some of the other plants for forage, and you can just build a bank den and live out your days kind of happily with minimal work. And so that's kind of the, if you will, the high value habitat. And in my area, that's also high conflict habitat because you've got waterfront properties. That's, high value human real estate and people planting ornamental trees, and those trees get cut down and they call the exterminator, and the beaver get trapped out, and then, new beaver move in because it's good beaver habitat, and those get trapped out. And especially on some of these really excellent beaver habitat sites, where you've got a niche opening up that all the other neighboring beaver want to get into because that's like a prime territory. You can have these properties that are sort of black holes in the beaver population where they're just sucking colonies from the main stem population. And so what I think we're seeing in this area especially is that you never hit carrying capacity on the main stem with beaver population, right? Like those niches are never full, such that the teenage dispersing beaver are forced up into the tributaries where they've got a dam and kind of make their living. Higher up where we would see all the cascading benefits of beaver dams. So that's a really important thing to think about too, is, what is carrying capacity on this site, and are we at that?
Yeah, like
trapping pressure. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, because like moving up where we need them and keep the water slow. I wanted to mention that where we live, if you look in the Takelma language of one of the indigenous tribes that lived here for thousands of years, the name of the Applegate is Spink. K is a place suffix. Spin means beaver, and it means place of the beaver. That's where we live. That's the Applegate. Yeah. So they want to be everywhere, and water wants to go slow, starting up, like you said. But if we don't let them move up into the tributaries, if we keep their populations low, anyway, yeah, let's go on.
Yeah, well, and so then another spot that we really want to see them is high in the tributaries, because then they're sequestering water early on in the watershed, right? And especially as we're struggling with diminished snowpacks in my area and droughts, sequestering that early runoff water is really important. And often as you get into the high tributaries, that's the land that's in public domain, so it'd potentially be easier to have beaver populations there. But it's hard to get beaver to disperse to that habitat naturally when all of these niches in the lowland are yet to be filled. So if we're looking at like what are those projects, what are those limiting factors that we can address in this situation where we've got reduced beaver population? You know, we've got a good toolkit. We've got the tree protection and the flow devices. You know, minimizing that conflict on these sites. We also need to look at making it harder to kill beaver right now in North America, well, even in the state. So the beaver is the state animal of Oregon, and yet it's really easy to kill a beaver on private land. They're considered a predatory animal, so you can kill as many without any regulation, however you'd like, and you don't have to report it to anyone. And on public land, they're a fur bearer, so you can trap them for fur, and there's no bag limit on that, and it's voluntary reporting. So as we start to kind of move into looking at beaver as an ally in restoration, but also in recovering some of these listed species that we're spending, you know, millions and millions and millions of dollars working to recover, it's going to take a serious look at making it a little bit, you know, introducing some regulation such that there has to be a more nuanced conversation before beaver are exterminated. And then education and outreach, just simply talking with folks is a big piece of that. So those are the kind of the things, you know, I'm trying to look at, like, okay, beaver on a landscape, what are the main reasons they're not there, and what are the things we could do? So in this situation of reduced beaver population, these are kind of our tools. If it's trapping pressure, so you've got a high system where it's disconnected from the source population and they've all been trapped out, you know, but you want them back there for water retention and such. That's when you can start talking about relocation of animals too, like taking problem animals from lowland areas and moving them up. But then again, you have to look at take regulation so that they don't just get recreationally trapped out immediately, and kind of education and outreach tied directly to that. And those areas of degraded beaver habitat, you've got your main limiting factors of either vegetation, velocity, or in-stream conditions. So basically, if it's a long riffle with no complexity or pools, that's really hard for beaver to go up and make a stand in. And so as we look at kind of addressing these limiting factors, we've got the toolkit already for vegetation. We can do riparian planting, and we're seeing this where folks are doing riparian buffer planting for other reasons, you know, for filter strips on ag runoff and such, and then inadvertently drawing beaver into the area because they planted the limiting factor. So you'll get these areas where then suddenly beaver show up for the first time in 100 some odd years. People are like, oh, we didn't know there was beaver habitat here. And it's like, well, there wasn't, and you just planted it. Same thing with beaver dam analogs or large woody debris placements. These are other tools that we can use for addressing a limiting factor. So these are bread and butter restoration projects already in my area. And if we start strategically looking at them too as like addressing the limiting factor for beaver on the landscape, I think we can help compound that. And then for in-stream conditions, it's really the same. It's the same two things, breaking that up and creating channel complexity. As we get into human conflict, infrastructure flooding, and agricultural flooding, and the residential urban world, we've got the same. We've got a toolkit too. So it's the flow devices in places where they're applicable, and then really just getting out and talking with folks too. I mean, folks think that beaver live in their dams, and they think they eat fish, and they think they'll attack you. There's a lot of stuff just to having this initial conversation, especially as you get into the urban landscape. And we've got the tools again to address these places where instead of beaver, instead of that being the black hole in the population, we can kind of stabilize that population. So zooming back out and looking at these 3 areas that beaver are limited on the landscape, these are the tools that we've got to take action on that, and we can kind of rank these on a level of sort of the low-hanging fruit, if you will. These are the tools in green are those tools where you've already got beaver on a landscape somewhere doing good work, right? So these are the things that we can employ to retain beaver where they're at, right? And this seems like the first important place to focus because those are the spots beaver are choosing to be, and those are the spots that will create dispersal on our landscape if we're able to stabilize the population there. Then we get into the projects, the things that are grant funded and more heavy impact, the riparian planting and the beaver dam analogs and woody debris projects. And then finally, the relocation, this is the one that everybody loves to do because it's really fun to hold a beaver and to save a beaver that's going to otherwise be lethally trapped. But it's also kind of the most heavy-handed in a sense. We're removing animals from where they've chosen to be on the landscape, and we're deciding that we think they would be better somewhere else. So if we organize these by a ranked kind of how much human input are we creating here, we've got a lot of folks working on relocation. That's something in my area that a lot of people jump on because it's great. You get to both get hands-on with the animal and save animals that are otherwise going to be lethally trapped. We've got a lot of folks working on the project angle. So SWCD stands for Soil and Water Conservation District. These are kind of the organizations that help farmers. Watershed councils, these are the organizations like the one I work for that take in grant funding, really based around recovery of fish populations especially, but also tied in with farmers and creating economic viability. Then you've got the agencies, you've got the tribes and the NGOs all working in this project world. But when you get down to really the low-hanging fruit, like how do we help beaver retain on the landscape where they are right now, you kind of drop out of the sexy projects and you get into stuff that's, putting in flow devices, protecting trees, working with folks to educate them. And there's less and less people in there. So, I've got my little small business. There's other folks starting to work in this realm. And then what I would argue is kind of the lowest hanging fruit as far as retaining beaver on the landscape, regulating the ability to take beaver. There's not really anyone in my area working on that. We've had a couple recent NGOs actions where they've looked at starting to limit some of the lethal take, but it's interesting as you kind of pull apart all these things that humans are doing in relation to beaver on the landscape. I think we could focus more at the bottom level here and just kind of assisting them where they already are and potentially have much greater impact. So this is a cool shot. This is a beaver dam on my home creek where I grew up, Thompson Creek. This is a site that we actually did restoration work on, and a couple years later the beaver moved in. And we hadn't had beaver on Thompson Creek for quite a number of years. And Thompson Creek, so my family bought this land from some folks that had lived here since the 30s. And I was talking to the lady who grew up here, and she was describing swimming in Thompson Creek every summer. And it was cold, deep water. And then I remember, you know, in the 90s, growing up here, I swam in Thompson Creek every summer. It was cold, deep water. And I remember, you know, you'd walk across the hay pasture and you'd try to walk slowly in the heat of the summer just to get really hot because you knew that water was going to be so cold when you jumped in. And starting in about 2005, Thompson Creek went dry in the summer. And, you know, it was kind of on an every other year cycle. And probably for the last 5 or 6 years now, it's been bone dry every summer. And our creek isn't alone. I mean, this is a broad trend we're seeing across the watershed. So Beaver occupied this site. They built a series of these dams. And as the creek started to dry up, these dams retained water, and the creek went fully dry upstream, and then a couple weeks later it went fully dry downstream, and yet you still had water in these ponds for nearly 2 months into the summer after the rest of the creek had dried up, and you still had juvenile salmonids in here, and it was still a functioning system, and eventually that reach dried up too. And the beaver bailed off into a nearby irrigation pond to wait out the rest of the summer. And it feels like it starts to get at, you know, what could be possible in these systems. You know, if it wasn't just one isolated colony trying to make a stand, but you had an upstream beaver pond feeding the hydrology into this one, and downstream ones capturing the runoff from this one, you could really build up a landscape, and maybe we would have had water, you know, all summer long again. So that's kind of the motivation that I'm coming from and doing this work. And there's my contact info.
Beautiful. Thank you, Jacob. Let's all give a international round of applause for Jacob. That was I think the most detailed, informative talk on the beaver I've ever heard of. We're going to add to it before we get to the Q&A. I'm going to share screen real quick, a presentation that I said I would. So Scott Mcgill has one of the largest professional ecosystem restoration companies around in the North America, right, Jacob? Yeah. Ecotone. Yeah. So we're going to hear from Scott, and I think he fills out a nice bit because his company has been around for decades, and they've gone through this kind of transformation from this classic streamside planting sort of model, like I did with you, Jacob, last year, largely. Yep. And they've moved into this more, wow, this was wet, and let's do something else, and then the beaver come in, and then it really happens. And moving from this event-based restoration to process-based restoration. So let me share my screen, and let's hear a little bit from Scott, and then Benjamin and everyone start to collect your questions in the Q&A box. And here is Scott Mcgill.
Welcome, Scott.
Okay, thanks, Tim. So my name is Scott Mcgill, and let me I'll get my my slides going here. Is that showing?
Yes. Yep.
Okay. So my name is Scott Mcgill. I'm with Ecotone. We're a design build ecological restoration company based in Forest Hill, Maryland, on the East Coast. And just wanted to share with you a few points about our company, kind of where we're headed, what we do, and more importantly, why we do it. So, you know, we started back in 1998. We're in our 20th year, and we started with 2 people in a basement doing environmental consulting work. And over the years, we've grown steadily, slowly, to the point now where we're about 75 people strong. We have designers as well as 10 crews out there building ecological restoration work. You know, I guess it was a few years ago when our
Scott, can you make your screen big? Can you go back to the beginning? Maximize your there you go. So we don't see your whole
There we go. Is that better?
There you go. All right.
So a couple of years ago, I was thinking deeply about where we were headed as a company and the kind of work that we were doing. And it was at a time when work here in the Chesapeake Bay region of Maryland was exploding. There was many opportunities. All of a sudden, there was all these different ways to get funding for your projects. And, you know, I felt strongly that we weren't going to get to the restoration goals that we wanted for the Bay by having approaching our systems with an engineering sort of static approach to restoration. What I mean by that is, you know, the use of a lot of stone, logs, factors of safety where, you know, engineers are averse to risk, so they're just going to put more stone in a project. And what we were turning out was a bunch of stabilization projects that really didn't have a whole lot of ecological value. And I've always been attracted and interested in wolves, and you know, I was attracted to this idea out in the Yellowstone ecosystem where, you know, wolves had actually been brought back into the landscape and were you know, through trophic cascades, were providing, you know, all these wonderful benefits, not only for wolves, but for other species. And because they were pushing elk and deer out of the ravines, you know, deer and elk were acting like deer and elk again. And they were putting less pressure on willows and aspens. And all of a sudden, you know, the landscape started to revegetate, and beavers started coming back, and wolverines did better, and grizzly bears did better. And I started thinking, like, you know, what kind of policy shift could we have here in the East, where we would be able to facilitate water quality restoration, all in support of restoring the Chesapeake Bay, you know, just using nature. And, you know, just to illustrate what I'm talking about, these were all projects that Ecotone has built in the last year. You can see the two at the top are strongly vegetated. They look like natural systems where they use a lot of wood. We're doing floodplain reconnection work. And then the projects on the bottom are bid jobs where we were building someone else's designs. And you can see the excessive use of rock, very engineered approach, and factors of safety upon factors of safety. And I said, you know, there's got to be a better way. And I started thinking about my sites, and I love to go back to our old restoration sites and see how they're performing, you know, projects that we built 10, 15 years ago. And what I found was that beaver had colonized almost every one of them. And I said to myself, maybe beaver, being a keystone species, has a really important role to play in restoring the Bay. And then I started to think about, you know, our role as practitioners, as contractors, as designers. You know, should we just continue on and continue to promote the status quo, or did we want to do something different? Did we want to promote an alternative to that approach? And that's when I just decided, from a company standpoint, that I really wanted to honor the beaver and bring them in. I went out west and learned all I could about beaver and how they can be used as a tool for restoration. And I brought that technology back to the East and started to share with others. And it wasn't an easy sell, for sure. But you know, we've made it part of our branding. You know, not only are we using beaver in our restoration and using beaver as a sign of restoration success, but you know, we dress up as beaver in the 4th of July parade, and you know, we're known as the Beaver Company, and I'll take that every day of the week, because I think they can do what we do, but do it better and do it in a more effective way. So to shift gears, you know, for many years, we've been designing our streams as single thread channels, and putting an appropriate and stable plan form and profile and cross section. And I started looking at our streams, and we've done some research going back 300 years. We did some research and found some old land grants where the surveyors had actually described points they were at in the landscape. And we've actually found those points out in the landscape, and now they're high and dry, but 300 years ago, they were a very wet landscape. And the point is that, our landscape 300 years ago in the riparian area was dominated by the beaver. The uplands were dominated by humans. But our landscape was much, much wetter than it is now, not because of climate, but because of beaver, and the fact that we had our single thread streams weren't single thread at all, but they were multi-threaded wetland and stream complexes. So in these old surveys, you see words like marsh and swamp and Pocosin, and you see it in the soils. And that shifted gears for us as well, to the point where, we've changed the whole way that we're doing restoration. We used to design as, a single threaded natural channel design with riffles and pools. While we still have a component of that, we're leaving our sites very rough, very diverse. We're adding as much wood as we possibly can into the system. We're using the peat layer that's been there for hundreds of years, and we're smearing that peat and getting germination of seeds that haven't seen the light of day in 300 years. And to many of our colleagues, our sites look rough, unfinished, and they look like a battleground, as some people have said. To us, that's a sign of success. You can see here in some of these photos, we're leaving our floodplains in a very wet and oxbow-like condition. And we think that's where we get most ecological uplift. We also love the use of wood. We're taking wood from folks that, would have formerly chipped this material and look at it as a form of trash. And we're using it in our sites, taking landscapers, truckloads of wood, putting it on our floodplains. It gives us a nice roughness element. It gives us a great form of flood flow depletion, so that, water hits this wood that we've left in the floodplain, slows down, deposits that sediment on the floodplain. So these are just a few of the things that we've been doing as a company to shift from sort of your standard contractor type mentality to, folks that are trying to change the way we perform restoration. We embrace being that unicorn in the room. Some of the things, many of you may have used tree shelters in the past. I, for one, have put in many hundreds of thousands of tree shelters over the years. That was restoration for us years ago, was planting trees. We've been enlightened, and while we still plant lots and lots of trees, we're not using these shelters anymore. They create just wreaks of havoc, of difficulty for us. These shelters, they're plastic, they don't biodegrade, and we have to go back in and remove them from the landscape 10 years later. They create deformed trees when the shelters blow over. And so one of the things that we're doing, and I'll wrap up with this, is rather than sheltering each tree at about $10 per tree, we're saving 70% on some of our sites now by excluding deer from the landscape itself. This is an angled fence, and this is just one of the sort of innovative techniques that we're trying out. We install this fence at a 45-degree angle, and the deer and their lack of depth perception can't tell how far it is to clear that fence, even though they could physically. And so we're saving about 70% cost savings over the use of tree shelters. So this and many other techniques are some of the things that we're doing here at Ecotone. Try to make the world a better place, try to make our projects more functional ecologically. And yeah, I thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Beautiful. Thanks. Thank you, Scott. Those fences, are they like is that a temporary thing to reestablish some stuff? Do you ever remove those later, or is it, it's like a permanent thing?
Yeah, we'll remove them after the trees get to about 6 or 7 feet in height.
Right.
But for now, you know, and it doesn't eliminate the deer herbivory, but it does minimize it.
Yeah.
And that's what we're talking about is, you know, we can stand some minimal herbivory, but we can't stand, you know, every year that deer coming along on our tree shelters and nipping off that apical meristem.
Yeah.
You know, you can only take that for so long, and then you've got a 7-year-old 4-foot tree that's not long for this world.
Right. Great. The one thing I've got to ask you about, I know I've heard you guys talk about, if you could address the what I've heard you say, event-based versus process-based restoration. You just
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, can you speak to those terms and what that means, because it seems crucial. Yeah.
Yeah. So event-based is really, we get a project, we design it, we permit it, we build it, and then we're done, right? We move on to the next one. The process-based is really honoring the fact that nature takes longer, and you know, we don't always get the result that we want from that one big effort. That it takes a lot of small efforts after that one initial effort to get ecology jump started. And sometimes, you know, we're taking risks, we're being creative, we're being innovative, and to be honest, sometimes things don't work out right the way we thought. So the adaptive management, that process-based approach to restoration, really allows you to go in and try some new things, and you're able to, I think it helps the brain to be more creative and innovative, knowing that, hey, if it doesn't work, we can come in next year and fix this.
Yeah.
You end up with a totally different approach to the restoration, and it really sets you free to be creative.
Yeah, and it seems to also tie in directly to the beaver, because like you said, the beaver came into your sites after you kind of made a little more habitat for it, and then really made it nice. So it's like this idea of inviting these other intelligence, and then kind of you let go control, because the process, you're helping to restart this process and so to me, that kind of letting control go over to other systems managers like the beaver, being a part of what we mean by process-based restoration, right? It's because these processes are all alive, right?
Oh yeah, the beaver is process-based restoration. I mean, he's the embodiment of process-based, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, when beaver come into our sites, that's a real sign of success for us.
Yeah.
If beaver come in, then we did a good job with floodplain reconnection, with riparian restoration, and you know, we're lucky in the East in that we don't need to relocate beaver to our sites. You know, if you build it, they will come, is sort of the mantra. So I've yet to do a floodplain reconnection project where beaver didn't find it over the next 5 years or so. And
have you
make a home.
changed your planting prescription at all toward that goal of seeing beaver come into your site? Because I know often beaver are the intent of some riparian planting projects, and so it's pretty cool to think about them as a partner in that. And how have you tweaked your species makeup or your density or the way you lay out
or where you plant, right? Or
I mean, we're planting a lot more willows, a lot more alder, a lot more cottonwood, and we plant other species as well, for sure. But you know, I'd say 50% of our plantings these days are beaver food. You know, that's really what we're planting is beaver food, and especially species like sandbar willow. It's native in the East, I guess. Has different names out west, you know, coyote willow. It grows rhizomatously. So if we plant one and we've set conditions correctly, you know, come back 3 years later, we've got 10 sandbar willows. So that's where you can get sort of a multiplier effect as well. And beaver love it, and they love it as food and as dam building material. So
beautiful.
stuff.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much, Scott. Appreciate you.
Okay. Tim, Jacob, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Let's give a hand for Scott Mcgill. That guy's awesome. Yeah. So thank you for that. We are going to move on to question and answer now. I think we got Benjamin up. He's working with his parents' land. There used to be beaver there. So we're going to bring Benjamin up to talk about his property. Welcome, Benjamin. Take yourself off of mute here. And let's chat about your property for a minute.
I think I'm off of mute. You can hear me, right?
Yeah. Welcome.
Right,
Meet Jacob. Yes.
Hey, Benjamin.
Jacob, thanks for doing this. I'm really excited to get a beaver nut going here.
Sweet.
This is nice. I can actually turn my camera around. I'm in the northeast Finger Lakes region between Cayuga and Owasco Lake. Can you see that okay? Doesn't look too good from my phone. All right, can you see that mouse wiggling around?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is pretty sloped. I'm feeling like it's not habitable for beaver at this point, unless there was a lot of beaver dam analogs made to really push it up and flatten it somehow and accumulate the sediment. But here, where the mouse is Crane Brook stream, which goes this way. It turns.
How steep, Benjamin?
What?
By the way, how steep are we talking here?
So the computer I'm on right now, I can't get to the map so these are the pictures I took from the map. Let's see, I'm going to say it's like 50 to 80 feet drop from this bottom left here, southeast to the northeast.
Okay.
And you can see that stream that I was just pointing out going here. And unfortunately, there's a resident right here where that looks like, I think, the most possible place to have their lodge. So this apparently to the west there was a beaver habitat right about I think right about here. Yep. So that I don't know if you speak in contour lines. It's probably terrible to see actually. But I'll shake it with my hand as much as possible. Maybe I'll base my elbow here. So I think the most possible would be this right here, but do you know if there's a limitation to the slope in that this area seems pretty contour line tight, if you will?
Right.
The previous habitat was here, so those are all spread out.
So if you go back to your satellite view, your Google Earth, where was the previous habitat in that picture? Is that?
Yeah, I can get that.
Okay, it's zoomed out further than
this is a
what we're
picture
seeing.
of a Google thing.
Okay. Yeah, so beaver really like that kind of 3%, that 3% gradient.
Okay.
They'll kind of go up to like 5 or 6, something like that. When you get over 10, you're into the sort of higher streams that you won't probably see beaver in. And if you kind of think of streams as transport reaches and depositional reaches, too. And of course that's always in flux as well with things like incision, but the beaver really are focused around those areas of a stream where you've got that transport reach, the depositional reach. So areas of slower moving water where things are fanning out. So if you have incision on your property that you could kind of start addressing with BDAs or something where you can try to like start shifting that from sort of a trenched system to something that's more of a area that's a grading up, that could be a strategy. But yeah, if your base level of your whole topography is too steep, then you're probably not looking at beaver.
Yeah, I think the closest one of it being level, and I've zoomed out here, if you can see that okay, a nice little glare on the screen, unfortunately. As it does this hard 90 degree angle, I think it's flat there, and the original stream, talking like that guy was 300 years ago, might have been like there, but the original beaver habitat that you were asking about is over here. I can zoom into that if you want.
Just looking at the fact that you've got farm fields all around you.
Yeah,
I can't imagine
fields.
that you're going to be gradient limited because
So
that
it
looks
look-
like, you know, big agricultural depositional valley bottom.
There's, let's see, you can, so the original beaver habitat here, it's sort of down the watershed they meet, and where I got some willow sprouts and put in along the stream this past weekend, there's that tree right there I got it from, and I feel like the guy actually said his son saw a beaver like in the past couple of weeks there, so that was exciting.
Nice.
And then,
so that tells you that you're not limited in population. You know, if you've got something else keeping them from occupying that site, and so it's probably, you know, either, I mean, what is the in-stream conditions of that creek look like? Because you might be on the right track of planting willow. You know, you could, if that indeed, if a vegetation buffer, if the forage available is your limiting factor, then that's a fix that you can do.
okay, some lingo words that I'm not getting, but
Sorry.
it's sort of flat on one side.
Which words?
Like it'll kind of.
By the way, if there's a word that you're
well,
not getting, ask it so other people can learn too. Yeah.
Yeah, there was the deposit, T word, terrestrial deposit, or, and then no.
Sometimes I just say things and I forget.
Yeah. It was like right off in the beginning when you were talking about BD, the water.
Oh.
Like slowing it down, or the rate at which it is digging out sediment or something is what I kind of assumed.
Like a transport reach versus a depositional reach? Is that?
That was, yeah, depositional.
Can you explain that distinction,
sediment.
Jacob?
So if you think about streams, right, they're moving water, but they're also moving sediment as well. You know, we're getting erosion in the mountains that's moving out into the ocean eventually, and those wide valley bottoms, you know, these places that humans now farm, are the products of deposition from, you know, eons of soil, you know, being deposited because the water slows up enough. So in a really steep stream, you'll get a stream that's just basically the biggest rocks that the stream can't move, right? And as that water slowly slows down, smaller and smaller rocks will drop out of solution, if you will. So you'll get a diminished sediment size, like, you know, the rocks in the stream bed, as you watch your velocity drop off. So once you're down on the valley bottoms, you've got areas where the stream is kind of moving stuff through, like they're transporting sediments or what have you, and areas where it's fanning out and kind of depositing. And that's what beaver do a lot really well, is kind of create those conditions to, you know, to trap those sediments and create more deposits quicker.
Makes me think about Louisiana, that big deposit where there's a lot of topsoil that is there, and
totally.
Yeah. And then I just wanted to ask
about Louisiana.
Thailand.
I think I heard it from you, Jacob. Is you know, North America was mostly beaver. You get some areas of the Southwest where maybe not. And one of the areas where you don't see them is as soon as alligator habitat starts. Country.
It's
that
a
was
predation problem.
Interesting thing to learn there, yeah.
Yeah, if you look at the alligator sort of territorial boundary, it is directly butting up with when beavers start, which is cool. So yeah, they are mutually exclusive.
Sweet.
And then I just wanted to ask about the tiling. On that drainage age mindset and into holding, slowing, and storing as much as possible, I see the tiles as, in my goal of bringing beaver to make habitat and find food and fiber production around that, the tiling is getting getting rid of that natural capital, that water, and would it be best to, what I've done is plant willows with the tentative plan in however long it takes for those roots to penetrate the tiles, or would I dig those up at some point? I'm also not going into this so hardcore that I want to just, okay, I want beaver, I'm going to tear up these tile and that's that.
So Benjamin, the fact that you've got tiles tells me that your gradient is fine for beaver. Like,
right, that makes sense.
Yep. So I
there's
think,
a swamp here.
yeah, right. So I think you're on the right track with planting willow, probably.
And an aspen quaker apparently is one that is native. So
excellent. Yeah, look at those native species and look at the ones that coppice, because that'll give you a hint. This was one that co-evolved with beaver. So what are my
riparian
native
coppice.
species that
Yeah.
coppice? Yep.
Yeah.
Right.
Riparian native
coppice.
species that coppice is
Yep. That
awesome.
really gives you a perfect hint on the the good food source for beaver, and I think that's an interesting thing some of the folks in Europe are doing too, is landscapes that have been devoid of beaver for so much longer than ours have. You can really start to put together the pieces of the puzzle just by looking at those species that clearly co-evolved. But on tile, so in my area it's very mountainous. We don't have tile, but as we moved north in the state up into the Willamette Valley, there's a lot of tile up there. So I'm not very versed in tile restoration because I don't do it in my watershed council job, but I know a little bit from working with beaver in the tile landscape. And a lot of farmers have concerns around maintaining their tile. So it's been all through the lens of like keeping beaver from adversely impacting that draining. Right, and it seems like there's two different tiles, right? There's the old world tiles that were like actual tile material, and then there's like the perf pipe that people put in after the fact too. So I know one strategy that folks have been deploying, if you got the real tiles, that were once earthen and then got hardened, and it's actually been going in and just crushing them. Like you can drive, you can dig it up to the point where you can just crush the whole tile line into the ground, and it's kind of minimal disturbance compared to actually unearthing the whole thing. So I know that's one strategy that's been employed. It's interesting. It still creates, you've still got a wick through your landscape because you've got all these overlapping tile pieces in this long kind of sinuous drain. It still goes out to the
still a drain.
It's still a drain.
Heavily,
yeah. So you're not going to have the wetland soils retaining moisture in those areas.
It's like putting rocks in instead.
Yeah, exactly.
Almost.
You've got a French drain with peat gravel and a pipe in the middle, and now you've just got peat gravel or something. It's like still kind of functions similarly, but so I would look at, like, if you can't go and rip the whole tile out, I would look at strategically creating areas where, like, you take a section out and you plant willow in that section, such that your flow through the tile is then hitting these areas of vegetation and soil. You know what I mean? Like you could backwater your tiles, and that's a pretty good way of turning them off too. And so you could either block the outlet, and that basically backwaters the tile and turns it off, or you could disturb the outlet in such a way that you're planting that sort of native root structure and such in the way too. But I think if you don't want to go rip up a whole field, right, it just looking at, like, how do you keep those tiles, because the thing that people don't like is when the tiles get full of water and then they don't move any water anymore because they're full. So if you could block the exit, right, that might be your minimal disturbance.
To the highest one and see if I can split it and spread it from there, and then also
totally
block the bottom one. So hopefully we'll help the algal bloom issue that the whole country's having, and holding on to our soils, one of the other goals. So
sweet.
Thanks.
Sounds like a fun project.
Yes, terrifying. Managing old paradigms and trying to fit a really huge one into, I'm looking into something that isn't going to become full throttle in my lifetime, perhaps.
Yeah. The timeline thing is interesting. I mean, I think that's where we're getting ourselves in trouble with restoration work, especially in my area with grant-driven restoration work. Folks want to see, did your project succeed? And usually that means, like, do you have the right density of trees growing 3 or 5 years after someone invested in this project? And those process-based outcomes are on a gradient of succession too. So we need to look at like these human landscapes are in some sense a very degraded landscape that then there needs to be recovery from. And so looking at those first layers of succession is sometimes not what we want to see. We want to see like the apex of succession, these larger tree systems. So managing succession rather than managing for success. Right?
That's it right there. Yeah.
I stole that. Janine Castro in my state. Yeah, and then Benjamin, you know, it's tricky to try to figure out a way to monetize you know,
conservation,
a healthy ecology. Yeah.
Right. Like
I know
although
that
Leopold said we need to combine agriculture and conservation, I think that is crucial.
Yeah.
It's difficult.
You've got a whole ecology based on that system that beaver create too. So, you know, like I said, some of the early innovators in beaver restoration work were doing it from a selfish duck hunting point of view, right? And I know it's a whole different world, but sage grouse on the east side of my state are a big deal, and they were up for endangered species listing at one point too. And there was one fellow who looked at them as a tourist draw. You know, these males have this elaborate lekking display that they do in the springtime, and these really specific spots. And so this guy would bring in people to observe the lekking courtships, and you know, build a little like a seating area for people to observe this. And he had people flying in, you know, to observe this really rare phenomenon. And he made way more money than his cattle operation had made.
Oh, wow.
Just from the environmental tourism around this one bird doing this one courtship display. Right?
So Leopold had talked about a bird who did this crazy mating ritual where he would go up like really high and then go down and do a swirl. So those are, you know, what animals do to recreate that's just a fascinating philosophical endeavor right there.
Yeah, or what females from that species have chosen to select males to do in order to prove to them something, right? Yeah, the peacock's tail is a perfect example of that, right? Why did the female peahen see what does she see in a male having that elaborate display? I don't think there's yet to be a very good theory on that, but there's something there.
I guess with that we will end it. And
this is great, Tim. Thanks,
Benjamin. Thanks for letting us deep dive into your property and apply some of these concepts in a whole different place from the Pacific Northwest. And thank you so much, Jacob. This is the most comprehensive and coherent beaver presentation I have ever heard of, and that might possibly exist on the internet now. And thank you so much. Jacob, give us one more bit of insight to take us out.
I don't know if I have one more bit of insight. I think it's great that a bunch of people from around the world gather around laptops with our own shaky webcams and we're exchanging these ideas. I think that's a positive note to end on.